at the Spaceship Earth ride at Epcot Center. He was also a pilot, also an aircraft mechanic. You're going to hear that the defendant and Michael Shaver had some marital problems. In 2014, Michael Shaver and the defendant separated, and Michael Shaver moved out of the family home. In around early 2015, Michael Shaver moved back into the family home, presumably to try to work things out for the sake of the marriage and the kids. After Michael Shaver moved back into the family home, he started doing some projects around the house. And one of those projects was that Michael Shaver was digging an area in the backyard up that he was going to turn into a duck pond for the children. So witnesses are going to tell you that there's a portion in the backyard that had begun to be dug up for purposes of this duck pond. Then the weekend of November 7th, 2015 rolled around. The defendant, Michael Shaver, and the two children went to a tractor show in Fort Meade, Florida. There they met up with a co-worker and a friend of Michael Shaver's and his wife named Frank and Rita Merritt. You're going to hear that Frank Merritt worked with Michael Shaver at Epcot. Frank Merritt will tell you that Michael Shaver was acting normally, but the defendant was distant, she was quiet, she wasn't talking, and Frank Merritt will tell you there was obvious tension between the two of them. The defendant and Michael Shaver then left that tractor show, presumably went back home, and Frank Merritt will explain to you that that was the last time he ever saw or directly spoke to his friend and coworker, Michael Shaver. Frank Merritt texted Michael Shaver the next day, checking in on him, how things going. He got no response, which was unusual. He texted Michael Shaver the following day. Now we're into November 9th of 2015. Again, just to check on him. This time, Frank Merritt received a text message back from Michael Shaver's phone, which basically said,
Objection.
Yes, sir. Sidebar, please.
November 9th of 2015. And Frank Merritt received a text message back from Michael Shaver's cell phone indicating, I'm working on my marriage, leave me alone. This was obviously a text message, so Frank Merritt did not have any direct communication to be able to hear Michael Shaver's voice to verify it was the person who was actually sending the message. Incidentally, the evidence is going to show that Michael Shaver was likely dead at this point. Because of that response, though, Frank Merritt, honoring what he thought was Michael Shaver's wishes, didn't reach out to Michael Shaver again. And as I said, they worked together. They both worked at the Spaceship Earth ride at Epcot. They both were set to work on November 10th of 2015. They worked the night shift, which was 7 p.m. to 7 in the morning. Tuesday, November 10th, 2015 rolled around. Michael Shaver didn't show up for work. He didn't show up. He didn't call saying, hey, I'm not coming in. This was unusual for Michael Shaver not to show up for work and not to call saying, hey, I can't make it for whatever reason. November 11th, 2015, Wednesday, came along. Michael Shaver was supposed to work that day as well. Mr. Shaver didn't show up. Didn't call in and say, hey, this is what's going on, I can't make it to work today. So now that he has not shown up to work for 2 straight days and not called anyone letting him know, Michael Shaver's boss, John Borglum, gets involved. John Borglum tried to reach out to Mr. Shaver to find out what's going on. He did so, and John Borglum got a text from Michael Shaver's phone indicating he's not coming to work, that he was having issues at home, that he was in Georgia, and to go ahead and fire him. The evidence will show, ladies and gentlemen, that Michael Shaver was not in Georgia. Michael Shaver was dead. After not showing up for work for several days, after knowing that Michael Shaver had not shown up to work for several days, Frank Merritt went to the Shaver residence and made contact with his wife, the defendant, Miss Laurie Shaver. Frank Merritt asked about Mike. The defendant said Michael Shaver, her husband at the time, was in Georgia. He said that a co-worker of Mike's, a guy named Robert Mercado, picked Mr. Shaver up and drove him to Georgia, and he was gone. The defendant said that Michael Shaver left because she and Mr. Shaver had an argument. Frank Merritt did notice that Michael Shaver's car was still on the Shaver residence property and it had a flat tire. Frank Merritt texted Michael Shaver here and there several times. He got responses occasionally from Michael Shaver's phone, but never had the ability to speak directly with Michael Shaver to verify that Mr. Shaver was the one sending those messages. As I said, the evidence will show that Michael Shaver was dead. He was not the one responding to those text messages. The evidence is going to show that the defendant gradually got rid of Michael Shaver's property. She sold his four-wheelers, sold some expensive tools, sold guns. She knew Michael Shaver wasn't coming back. She knew Michael Shaver wasn't going to need those things because she knew Michael Shaver was dead. You're going to hear from Robert Mercado, the person that the defendant indicated picked Michael Shaver up and drove him to Georgia. Robert Mercado also worked with Michael Shaver at Epcot, but they didn't work at the same ride. They worked at different rides, so they didn't see each other on a regular basis. They saw each other occasionally, but not all the time. Mr. Mercado will explain to you that there were plans for a work-type Thanksgiving get-together to happen at the Shaver residence. So Mr. Mercado sent some text message to Michael Shaver several weeks before this get-together was supposed to happen to see, hey, are there plans still to go? Are we still doing this thing? He got no response. Mr. Mercado texted Michael Shaver several times, 2 or 3 times. Eventually, Michael Shaver's phone responded to Robert Mercado and said, leave me alone, I'm working on my marriage and my family. Robert Mercado did not actually speak with Michael Shaver at that time. That communication was done by text only. Again, the evidence will show Michael Shaver at the time was dead. Most importantly, Robert Mercado will explain to you that at no time during the weekend or around the weekend of November 7th of 2015 did he go over to the Shaver residence. At no time did he load Michael Shaver up in his SUV. And at no time did he take Michael Shaver to Georgia, directly contradicting the statements that the defendant was making to various people about where Michael Shaver went. You'll hear from Corey Lutzow, another friend and co-worker of Mr. Shaver. They also worked together at Spaceship Earth, and he was also supposed to go to this work Thanksgiving get-together at the Shaver residence. Mr. Lutzow will tell you that after the weekend of November 7th, 2015, he never saw or personally spoke to Michael Shaver. You'll hear from Michael Shaver's family. You'll hear from his father, Doug Shaver, his brother, Brian Shaver, Christine Court, his sister, Desiree Snyder, his niece, Stacy Turner, his sister. And they'll explain to you that they had contact with Michael Shaver over the years to varying degrees and varying frequencies. But following November of 2015, none of those family members ever saw or personally spoke to Michael Shaver. They received some messages here and there, maybe by text or some Facebook messages, but never actually had any contact with Michael Shaver to actually hear his voice and to verify he was alive. The evidence will show that was because Michael Shaver at that time was dead, and he was not the one sending Facebook messages and text messages. You'll hear from a man named Scott Amatuccio. He was a close friend of both the defendants and Michael Shaver's, because they all grew up together. He'll tell you very similar information about not seeing or directly speaking with Michael Shaver after November of 2015. For a several-year period of time between November of 2015 into 2018, Mr. Amatuccio eventually realized, I haven't heard from Mike recently. I really haven't heard anything from him. Started to get a little bit concerned. So Scott Amatuccio reached out to Michael Shaver's family, who he knew because, again, he grew up with Michael Shaver, and learned that nobody had directly spoken with him or seen him since November of 2015. Scott Amatuccio also learned about a concrete slab that had been laid in the back of the Shaver residence. And he became concerned. Because of this concern, Scott Amatuccio reached out to the Lake County Sheriff's Office and asked that they go to the Shaver residence, somebody from law enforcement go to that Shaver residence and try to make contact with Michael Shaver if he was there, or find out what's going on with Michael Shaver. Haven't heard from him. I also asked him to take a look at that concrete slab in the back where there was now a fire pit, same place that duck pond was supposed to be. So based on the information received by Scott Amatuccio, Lake County Sheriff's Office became involved. On February 16th of now 2018, Deputy Corey Anderson from the Lake County Sheriff's Office went out to the property and made contact with the defendant, Laurie Shaver. Deputy Anderson asked about Michael Shaver, asked about, where's your husband? The defendant said that she and Michael Shaver were separated, that he picked up and left, and that she had no idea where he was. Based on Scott Amatuccio's concerns about this concrete slab where this duck pond was going to be in the back, Deputy Corey Anderson asked permission to go and take a look around the property. The defendant allowed that. Deputy Anderson got to the area where this concrete slab was located, and he noticed something unusual about that slab. He noticed that there was a depression in that concrete slab, the place where that slab was sagging into the ground. Deputy Anderson knew that when a body is buried and a body is decomposing, that decomposition process eventually leaves a void where that body is located, which causes depression. Seeing this depression in the concrete, combined with the concerns of Scott Amatuccio, and now thinking this could be a grave, Deputy Anderson became more suspicious. He actually took out his phone and took a couple pictures of this depression. He then went and provided this information to other detectives at the Lake County Sheriff's Office. He reported what he had found and all this information. On March 9th of 2018, law enforcement obtained a search warrant. And a search warrant is basically a document that's signed by a judge that allows law enforcement to go to a location and search and collect certain evidence. So based on the authority given to this by the search warrant, law enforcement, detectives, crime scene investigators went out to the Shaver residence to search for evidence related to the disappearance of Michael Shaver. Crime scene investigators trained in the collection of evidence and trained in the collection and excavation of human remains went out to the scene. And with the use of some ground-penetrating radar, their focus quickly turned to this concrete slab where there was a fire pit and where there was a depression in that concrete. Some heavy equipment was brought in to dismantle that fireplace and to break up that concrete slab to give them access to the dirt beneath the concrete slab. And that excavation process began. Crime scene investigators began that slow and painstaking excavation process by digging up dirt, sifting that dirt, separating potential evidence, and that process went for a period of time. As they dug and as they dug and as they sifted, they eventually came across a humerus bone, which is a bone in the arm. Because it was getting late at this point, and crime scene investigators realized that they have a lot more work to do and it's going to be getting dark pretty soon, they stopped the excavation process and put it on hold until the following morning when it became light out. Law enforcement officers were stationed and posted in the area to make sure that nobody came onto the scene to disturb any of the evidence or do anything to the Shaver residence. The next morning, law enforcement officers, crime scene investigators, medical examiner investigators, and other people went to the Shaver residence to continue this excavation process. As crime scene investigators continued to dig and continued to sift the dirt, they came across a blue tarp buried in the ground. Beneath that blue tarp, they found human remains. The bones and the human remains were completely skeletonized. Those human remains, there were socks on them, there was a pair of boxers and a pair of shorts on human remains, and a green ratchet type strap was wrapped around those bones. Crime scene investigators carefully collected the bones out of the grave, placed them on a tarp, and those bones were transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy to be done. While still on scene, one of the crime scene investigators, Jessica Holcomb, made contact with Michael Shaver's father, Doug Shaver. Doug Shaver had come down from Georgia, down to Claremont, down to the Shaver residence, when he had learned that law enforcement was doing this investigation of what law enforcement had found the night before. Crime scene investigator Jessica Holcomb collected a DNA sample from Doug Shaver, took a swab and put it inside of his mouth and collected what's called a buccal swab, known as a known DNA standard for comparisons. You'll hear that the femur bone collected from the grave, along with the DNA standards from Douglas Shaver, Michael Shaver's father, were sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for DNA analysis. The DNA analyst, Edgar Perez, compared the DNA from that femur bone found in the grave to the known DNA standard of Douglas Shaver and confirmed what at this point was known to everyone. He determined that the DNA from the femur was consistent with coming from a bone of the biological child of Douglas Shaver. This confirmed Michael Shaver, who had been missing and not heard from since November of 2015, was in that grave, deceased. As I said, Michael Shaver's remains were collected and transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy to be done. And that's where Dr. Kyle Shaw, one of the medical examiners there, performed an autopsy. When he examined the skull that was recovered, he found an obvious single gunshot wound to the back of the skull, a hole right in the back of the skull, consistent with that of a gunshot wound. He found a bullet or a projectile inside the skull. And analysis later determined that that bullet was of a .38 caliber class, meaning that bullet could have been fired from a .38, a .380, a .357, or a 9 millimeter. That .38 caliber class can be fired of any of those types of caliber guns because the size is very similar. There was no exit wound to the skull, indicating a single entrance wound, hence the projectile being found inside the skull when it was recovered. Dr. Shaw examined the skull, found no other injuries or no other trauma. He examined all of the other bones collected. He found no other signs of trauma or injury, no chips, no breaks, no trauma whatsoever to any of the other bones. Based on his analysis, Dr. Shaw determined that the cause of death was the single gunshot wound to the back of the head and determined this to be a homicide. Michael Shaver's remains were then sent to a laboratory associated with the University of Florida in Gainesville. It's a laboratory called the Pound Lab, and they specialize in the analysis and examination of human remains. Dr. Samantha Coberly examined the remains as well, determined that the remains were consistent with a young to middle-aged male, of which Michael Shaver was, and they were consistent with having been in the ground for several months to several years. She also examined the skull, saw that single gunshot wound, and confirmed in her opinion that was the result of a single gunshot wound. She also examined the skull and the bones and found no other signs of trauma or damage or injury to any other part of the skull or any of the other bones recovered. And almost the entire skeleton was recovered. She also removed some bullet fragments from the inside of the skull, packaged those up, and sent those bullet fragments and all the bones back to the medical examiner's office. Law enforcement continued to investigate this crime. During the investigation, detectives spoke with a man named Robert Seha. He was a neighbor of the defendants at Shaver residence that lived nearby. And Robert Seha is going to tell you that about a month or two before law enforcement came to the Shaver residence to do this well-being check, which led to the unearthing of Michael Shaver's body, the defendant approached Mr. Seha and offered to sell him a pink and black .38 caliber handgun. The defendant indicated she needed the money to pay some bills, and Robert Seha bought this .38 caliber pink and black handgun from the defendant. Now, law enforcement took this gun because it was a .38 caliber, and the projectile found inside Michael Shaver's skull was of a .38 caliber class. So the gun, that .38 caliber gun that the defendant sold to Mr. Seha, was sent along with the projectile recovered from Mr. Shaver's skull to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for firearms analysis. Firearms analyst Megan Cleek examined that .38 caliber firearm and found it to be in working order. It was functional, it could be fired. She fired some test fires from that gun to then be able to take those test fire projectiles to scientifically and microscopically try to compare to the projectile found in Michael Shaver's skull to see if they were fired from the same gun. And she'll explain to you that every gun, when it fires a projectile, leaves impressions on the projectile. And some of those impressions, if they're clear enough, they're unique. And then in certain situations, not always, but sometimes, she can microscopically examine the projectile and say this projectile was fired by this gun because the microscopic impressions left match. Though the projectile found in Michael Shaver's skull, that .38 caliber class projectile, was capable of being fired from the gun, the impressions and the markings on the projectile were not clear enough for her to make any other determinations. Nothing indicated that the projectile found in Michael Shaver's skull could not have been fired from the gun. For instance, that projectile wasn't excluded as being fired from the gun. There was just not enough detail in the projectile for her to say definitively this bullet found in the skull was fired from this weapon. Now remember, we talked about Michael Shaver's friends and family had no direct either seeing him or speaking to him, hearing his voice. No direct contact with Michael Shaver after that weekend of November 7th, 2015. You'll hear that in December of 2015, a man named Travis Filmer came into the picture, came into the defendant's life. Travis Filmer was a man that the defendant met at the gym around December of 2015, and the defendant and Travis Filmer began to date, and shortly thereafter, Travis Filmer moved into the Shaver residence, the same residence that Michael Shaver's body was found in the backyard. You'll hear that around the end of April of 2016, a posting to the defendant's Facebook account showed a large number of concrete bags in the bed of a pickup truck. Since Michael Shaver's body was found under a concrete slab, law enforcement obviously became interested in this information. So after Michael Shaver's body was found, law enforcement obtained the Facebook records from both Michael Shaver's Facebook account and the defendant's Facebook account. And they looked into trying to determine, that's how they found that picture of the concrete in the bed of the pickup truck. And they started looking to determine when did that concrete slab get poured, and how did it get there? Detectives discovered a receipt from Home Depot dated September 12th of 2016 that Travis Filmer rented a concrete mixer. And you'll hear that Travis Filmer and his twin brother, Austin Filmer, poured that concrete slab and laid that concrete slab with that concrete mixer that Travis Filmer rented from Home Depot. And that was about 10 months after the November time period when nobody had ever seen Mr. Shaver, Michael Shaver, again. As law enforcement officers continued to investigate this case, they received a couple of names from the defendant's defense lawyer, Mr. Wiggs, as people who potentially had been involved in this homicide. Those names were James Ballou and Jereme Townshend. Doing their due diligence, law enforcement went and made contact with those two people. You'll hear from James Ballou, who'll tell you that he met the defendant in about 2014 when he was working at Don Neely Chevrolet and sold her a truck. Though James Ballou was married at the time, Mr. Ballou began a romantic relationship with the defendant in 2014. The defendant wanted a more serious relationship than what Mr. Ballou wanted. Mr. Ballou was not interested in that kind of serious relationship with the defendant. That relationship lasted only a few months when Mr. Ballou ended it around the middle of 2014 in order to go try to work things out with his wife. From that point on, James Ballou had no contact with Laurie Shaver. So at that time, when James Ballou ended the contact, Michael Shaver was clearly still alive as people had seen him. Law enforcement also tracked down Jereme Townshend. You'll hear from both Jereme Townshend and his wife, Vanessa Townshend. Jereme Townshend will tell you that he met the defendant in a park around September or October of 2015, about 1 or 2 months before Michael Shaver dropped off the face of the earth. Jereme would take his and his wife's child to the park where he would meet up and where he met Laurie Shaver, who was there at the park with her child, Aiden. Jereme and his wife Vanessa were going through marital problems at the time, and Jereme and the defendant began an affair. That affair started around December of 2015, about a month after Michael Shaver was last ever seen or heard from. Mr. Townshend would go to the Shaver residence during the defendant's lunch hour. He and the defendant would meet up sexually. And Jereme Townshend will explain to you that he never met Michael Shaver, and the defendant told him that she and Michael Shaver were divorced. The defendant told Jereme Townshend the same story that she's told other people, that Michael Shaver, or someone came and picked up Michael Shaver, took him to Georgia, and she hasn't seen from him since. The same story that Robert Mercado, the person she says picked Michael Shaver up, says never happened. Around February of 2016, the affair between Jereme Townshend and the defendant basically started falling apart. The defendant wanted more out of the relationship than it was. Jereme Townshend saw this relationship as more of a sexual fling type relationship, didn't want it to get serious, but the defendant did. The defendant wanted Jereme Townshend to file for divorce from his wife and wanted Jereme Townshend to move in with her into the Shaver residence, the same residence Michael Shaver's body was found buried behind. Jereme Townshend didn't want that, didn't want to divorce his wife, didn't want it to get that serious, and decided that he wanted to work things out with his own wife. Jereme Townshend and the defendant argued about the status of their relationship together. The defendant started giving Jereme Townshend an ultimatum. You get rid of your wife, come be with me. And she was going to expose the affair to Jereme Townshend's wife. A few months after this fight between Jereme Townshend and the defendant about exposing the affair, Jereme Townshend's wife, Vanessa Townshend, received flowers.
Objection. Objection approach.
Let's have a sidebar.
few months after this fight between the defendant and Jereme Townshend, where the defendant threatened to expose this affair, Jereme would leave his wife and come be with her. Jereme Townshend's wife, Vanessa Townsend, received some flowers at the school where she worked as a teacher, and there was a message with those flowers. The message indicated, check your Facebook account. So, Vanessa Townsend checked her Facebook account, and she noticed that she received a message from Facebook the same day she received these flowers from somebody purporting to be Michael Shaver. Remember, this is about 6 months after anybody had seen or ever spoke to Michael Shaver. In this instance, now November of 2015. This is April of 2016. Vanessa Townsend received this Facebook message from someone claiming to be Michael Shaver, which said that she'll be getting a special delivery. There was also a phone number associated with the delivery of those flowers in that Facebook message. She accepted this friend request from the person supposedly being Michael Shaver and noticed that there were previous messages to her from this same person claiming to be Michael Shaver over the preceding months. She had not seen those text messages or those Facebook messages beforehand because she wasn't a friend of Michael Shaver and didn't notice that they were there. So when she looked at those messages sent purportedly from Michael Shaver's Facebook account, she noticed evidence, or she noticed those messages included screenshots of conversations between Jereme Townshend and the defendant. They included photographs of Jereme Townshend and the defendant together. They were evidence and proof of the affair that the defendant was having with Jereme Townshend. And these messages, coincidentally, started very shortly after the fight between Jereme Townshend and the defendant, where the defendant was giving Jereme Townshend an ultimatum to leave your wife or I'll expose the affair. The evidence will show that these messages, these Facebook messages and photos and flowers, were clearly an effort to expose the affair, drive a wedge between Jereme Townshend and Vanessa Townsend, and drive Jereme back to the defendant. It didn't work. After much work with their marriage, Jereme Townshend and Vanessa Townsend got back together and they remained married. Law enforcement obviously wanted to investigate the source of these flowers, because we know they can't be from Michael Shaver. Michael Shaver's dead. They obtained search warrants. They obtained a search warrant, like I said, for the defendant's Facebook account and Michael Shaver's Facebook account. They found those Facebook messages from Michael Shaver's account to Vanessa Townsend's account, talking about the affair and the photos and the flowers and the delivery and things like that. They issued subpoenas for the defendant's bank records, for the victim's bank records, and you're going to see that the defendant and Michael Shaver had separate bank accounts. Detectives issued a subpoena for the defendant's cell phone records, for Michael Shaver's cell phone records. And eventually law enforcement officers received all of these records and started to pour through them when they came in. They found that Michael Shaver's cell phone had no outgoing calls after November 7th of 2015, which coincides with the last time anyone had ever seen or directly spoke with Michael Shaver. The defendant's cell phone records didn't show any phone calls or texts to Michael Shaver's number. Detectives looked at the defendant's bank records, and you'll hear that they traced the purchase of those flowers that were sent to Vanessa Townsend as coming out of the defendant's bank account. Further evidence that the defendant was the one that was responsible for sending those flowers and sending the Facebook messages, acting as if she was Michael Shaver, to Vanessa Townsend. Remember I said that there was a phone number associated with that Facebook message that was sent to Vanessa Townsend. Well, they looked into that phone number and determined that phone number was associated also with the defendant. Further evidence that the defendant was the one portraying herself to be Michael Shaver after Michael Shaver was dead. Because there were a variety of sources indicating that they received text messages or Facebook messages from Michael Shaver after that November 7th, 2015 weekend, detectives dove deeper into the records, and deeper especially into those Facebook records, to see if they could find evidence that someone was logging into Michael Shaver's Facebook records and portraying himself to be Michael Shaver, when Michael Shaver was dead. And the detectives found such evidence. Detectives investigated the internet protocol addresses provided by Facebook for the accounts of both the defendant and Michael Shaver's Facebook accounts. And for those of you who are not IT directors, an internet protocol, you'll hear that an internet protocol address or an IP address is kind of like a physical address. It is assigned to a particular location through the internet provider like Spectrum, Verizon, Cox, whatever it is that provides internet service to a house or a business. So for example, when I'm home, my home is assigned a unique IP address to my house through my internet provider, which just happens to be Spectrum. That IP address is what gives my home access to the internet. That IP address is unique to my house. It's going to be different than my neighbors. It's going to be different than Starbucks. It's unique to me, or to my house. Also on my home, or if it's a business is something that I called a router. When a router is a device that allows multiple devices inside the house to connect to the internet at the same time, such as if I'm on my phone, if I'm on my laptop, if my wife is on her phone and her laptop, they all can be used together and access the internet. The router sends out the signal to those devices. All of us and all those devices will share the same IP address because that IP address is unique to my house. So if I log into Facebook with my phone and I post a photo or I post a message or I do something in my account, Facebook, the organization of Facebook, keeps those records, and they keep the IP addresses associated with the device that activated Facebook. Often the internet provider will change IP addresses, but ultimately they are unique to the house. So if I'm at home, I'm logging on to Facebook, and Mr. Camuccio decides to come over to my house, and he logs into my network, we're going to be sharing the same IP address at that same time because we're in the same general location, the same house, using the same network and the same IP address. Detectives received those Facebook records from the defendant's account and Michael Shaver's account from November of 2015 up through about November of 2017. When the detectives got those IP addresses from Facebook, unfortunately they were not able to determine the physical address that IP address was assigned to because those records were too old and they had been purged by the provider, the internet service provider. They just didn't exist anymore. But what they were able to determine is that during that 3-year period of time, from around November of 2015 to November of 2017, Michael Shaver's Facebook remained active, despite the fact he was dead. There were postings during that period of time. There were photos posted. There were funny little memes posted on his account. His profile picture had changed. His account had been activated and deactivated. There was activity. Some of the activity on Michael Shaver's Facebook account actually occurred after that concrete slab under which his body was found was actually poured. So we know Michael Shaver couldn't have been doing that. When they examined the IP addresses associated with Michael Shaver and the defendant's Facebook account during that time period, detectives noticed that the same IP address was used by both the defendant's and Michael Shaver's Facebook accounts. Sometimes those Facebook accounts were accessed using the same IP address within minutes of each other. The evidence will show that because those accounts shared that same IP address, within sometimes minutes of activity on each of the accounts, that's consistent with those devices accessing the accounts being located in the same house. The evidence will show that such activity, combined with common sense and all of the other circumstances in this case, is consistent with the defendant logging into Michael Shaver's Facebook account and posting things portraying herself to be Michael Shaver, or acting as if she was Michael Shaver. The evidence will show that she did this to carry on the facade that Michael Shaver was still alive, to carry on the facade and alleviate the concerns of his friends or family members who may inquire. to alleviate the concerns of law enforcement who may be asked to go look into where Michael Shaver is. Done to torment Vanessa Townsend by sending her message portraying herself as Michael Shaver to expose the affair between the defendant and Jereme Townshend. All of this done after Michael Shaver. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, this is a case about common sense. When you look at all the evidence, you listen to the testimony of all the witnesses, you examine all the circumstances, not the least of which is Michael Shaver's body was found buried under a concrete slab in the backyard of the defendant's residence. There can only be one common sense conclusion, and that is the defendant is guilty beyond any reasonable doubt.